We're in the midst of a staggering epidemic of chronic disease. Everywhere you look, children are struggling with asthma, autism, ADHD, depression, obesity, diabetes, or leukemia. These disabilities, which were unusual when our grandparents were young, have doubled in just 2 generations. And today, 1 in 4 children have a chronic health condition. 1 in 4. These epidemics have less to do with genetics and more to do with the everyday toxic chemicals found in our environment. In fact, one brave mother in the UK stood up to her government to prove it. On February 15, 2013, Ella, a bubbly and happy child, died. The pathologist who conducted her autopsy said Ella had one of the most severe cases of asthma he'd ever seen. He listed the cause of death as a severe asthma attack. When Ella's mother saw the death certificate, she knew something was off. So she sued to have air pollution listed as the cause of her daughter's death. 7 long years later, she won. Air pollution was added as a cause to her daughter's death. This was the first time air pollution had been listed as an official cause of death in the UK, and it was a landmark victory. Ella's story shows that you don't have to live in the shadow of a lead smelter or a chemical plant to be surrounded by toxic chemicals. What I find so mind-boggling is that we've accepted these toxic chemicals as a regular part of our life. We even welcome them into our own home. What chemicals am I talking about? You've probably heard of some of them: lead, cadmium, mercury, pesticides, flame retardants, phthalates, bisphenol A, and air pollution, to name only a few. These chemicals aren't just found in factories or along polluted highways. They are in our food and water, in the dust inside our homes, in the air we breathe. We can also find them in children's bodies. Scientists have detected them and hundreds of other chemicals in the blood and urine of children. So how do children get exposed? Exposures to toxic chemicals begin early in life, really, really early. First, the fetus is bathed in a cocktail of chemicals passing across the placenta. Once a baby is born, it ingests more chemicals like PFAS, the forever chemicals, and dioxin in their mother's milk. And toddlers, pound for pound, toddlers eat, drink, and breathe more than older children and adults. Usually this would just be a fun fact, but when their food, drink, or air is contaminated, it means toddlers carry a heavier burden of chemicals in their blood. So how did we get here? Let me tell you a story about an environmental disaster that occurred in Japan. In Minamata in 1956, the villagers of a small fishing village began to see the fish die. The cats that ate the fish convulsed and died. The pregnant women who had eaten the most fish had children with birth defects. The fishing industry was decimated, but by this time, the villagers had eaten boatloads of fish. By 1958, locals discovered a horrible truth. The Chiso Corporation, the main employer in Minamata, had been dumping huge quantities of mercury-contaminated waste into the bay. A company chemist even confirmed that cats fed sludge from Chiso, developed seizures, and died, but the company ordered him to halt the research, and they covered it up. This was the first time the world had experienced industrial mercury poisoning in children. 2 years later, on the other side of the world, a new over-the-counter medication for nausea and nerves was licensed in Germany without being tested on pregnant women. The drug, thalidomide, was actively prescribed to pregnant women throughout Europe and as far away as Australia and Canada. In the months that followed, thousands of babies were born with stunted limbs and other birth defects. 40% of these babies died. These disasters, one a drug and the other an industrial chemical, sent shockwaves around the world. Previously, physicians assumed that the placenta, the organ that delivers oxygen and nutrients to the developing fetus, was a barrier to poisons. It turns out the placenta was not the foolproof barrier we thought it was. We now know that children are uniquely vulnerable to toxic chemicals. If mercury and thalidomide hadn't caused physical defects, we may never learn how dangerous they really are. So what happens when babies are exposed to toxic chemicals in utero? Warning, this might be a little depressing. Baby girls exposed to the pesticide DDT were 4 times more likely to develop breast cancer later in life. Babies exposed to PFAS and secondhand tobacco smoke were at increased risk for premature birth. Babies exposed to higher levels of phthalates, a chemical found in plastics, were 3 times more likely to develop ADHD. Babies exposed to air pollution doubles a child's risk for asthma. And here's a really disturbing figure. Leukemia is the most common form of cancer in children. 1 in 4 cases of leukemia can be traced back to pesticides, paints and solvents, smoking, highway traffic. Why aren't we doing more to prevent disease? Pediatricians get it. I asked 1,000 pediatricians if they would vote to increase funding to enhance the cure for childhood leukemia, arguably the poster child for finding a cure for cancer, or vote to increase funding to find ways to prevent childhood leukemia. It may surprise you what I found. Only 5 pediatricians, 0.5%, voted to increase funding to enhance the cure. Less than 1%. The rest, 99.5%, voted to increase funding to prevent childhood leukemia. That's staggering. Nobody's asked parents how they would vote, but I would bet they would vote with pediatricians. The problem is our regulatory system hasn't kept up with the science. Each year, more and more chemicals we were told were safe turn out to be toxic. So the unshakable belief that more chemicals means progress is so pervasive that we have ignored or minimized their downside. This was not an accident. For almost 50 years, the chemical industry led a mass marketing campaign, Better Living Through Chemistry, to distract people from the damage caused by toxic chemicals. We shouldn't be surprised that the industry is misrepresenting the science. But why do our governments and regulators allow it? It turns out that your government is okay poisoning you, but just a little bit at a time. 50 years ago, governments were faced with a monumental decision about how to regulate chemicals. After much back and forth and with little evidence, the agencies made a convenient assumption. They declared chemicals were safe at lower levels. The concept of acceptable levels was born. So what exactly does acceptable mean? It sounds harmless, comfortable, safe, right? But this couldn't be further from the truth. In plain language, acceptable means a certain amount of sickness and death is acceptable to avoid impeding economic growth. The chemical industry argued successfully that until a chemical was found to be toxic, they should just be allowed to use it. The approval system is totally backwards. What works for the legal system, innocent until proven guilty, does not work to protect our health. Once a chemical has a stamp of approval, the burden is on the regulator or independent scientist to prove that it is toxic, a long and arduous process that can take over 100 years. Toxic chemicals should not be innocent until proven guilty, and regulatory agencies should be able to ban or restrict the use of toxic chemicals based on suggestive evidence. Government agencies also failed to appreciate the immensity of the project. The number of chemicals in the environment is somewhere between 100,000 and 340,000. That's right, we don't even have a good estimate. And at the current rate of testing, it would take another 300 years to test them all. Every year, over 20 million people die across the globe from toxic chemicals and pollutants. 20 million. And like Ella, their death certificate won't tell you the root cause of their death. A little poison every day adds up to a lot of poison over a lifetime. The result? Mutations, accelerated aging, disrupted hormones and neurotransmitters, cancer. In other words, chronic degenerative disease, and even death. And here's what we know now. No amount of lead, asbestos, benzene, air pollution, or tobacco smoke is safe. And yet we continue to regulate them as though there is a safe level. So we've dug ourselves into a bit of a hole here. Toxic chemicals are everywhere. Children are born with a cocktail of toxic chemicals. Chronic disease is epidemic, and regulation is lagging. Is there any hope? Well, let me tell you about some studies that have made me optimistic. In the United States, the removal of lead from gasoline led to a 95% reduction in lead poisoning among children. In Scotland, a ban on smoking in public places led to a 15% reduction in babies being born prematurely among non-smoking mothers. That's better than any drug. In Mongolia, a trial of HEPA air cleaners to reduce indoor air pollution led to a 50% reduction in miscarriages and a 3-point increase in children's learning abilities. These are small and inexpensive steps that can have a big impact. So what can you do to reduce your own exposure and your family's exposure until we fix the system? Choose your daily rituals carefully. The things you do every day add up over the years. Avoid fragrances, pesticides, and tobacco smoke in and around your home. Whenever possible, choose food grown without pesticides. I know it can sound daunting and expensive, but the more people that choose organic, the less expensive it will become. Cook at home so you control the ingredients in your food. Avoid processed food and canned food. Yep, about 66% of canned goods contain bisphenol A or BPA, that chemical you are told to avoid in plastic water bottles. But most importantly, government agencies must develop laws and regulations to protect our children and families from toxic chemicals and pollutants.